Children raised deep within the American evangelical ecosystem in the 80s and 90s essentially grew up in two competing theological worlds. On Sundays, they were marched into structured, tightly controlled churches and taught to submit unquestioningly to the pulpit's authority. But on weekday afternoons, sprawled on living room carpets bathed in the glow of the television set, they were quietly and subversively discipled by an entirely different set of pastors. Today, we're exploring the profound cognitive dissonance of the late 20th century latchkey kid, and how a few unexpected figures secretly forged the theological survival kit of the modern era. I'm Ellison Keller, and you're listening to The Faithful Citizen. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees. The world's loud with noise, we cut through division. This is the faithful citizen, let's get to the wisdom.
The spiritual fracture of today makes much more sense once you examine the profound cognitive dissonance experienced by the late 20th century latchkey kid. Children raised deep within the American evangelical ecosystem in the 1980s and 90s essentially grew up in two competing theological worlds. On Sundays, they were marched into structured, high-control churches, weighed down by a theology of total depravity, and taught to submit to the pulpit's authority unquestioningly. But on weekday afternoons, sprawled on living room carpets bathed in the cathode ray glow of the television set, they were quietly and subversively discipled by an entirely different set of pastors. We've previously explored how the bizarre, generation-defining collision of VeggieTales and Rage Against the Machine produced a cohort of believers who demanded systemic justice, fueled by absolute biblical morality. But while Bob the Tomato and Zach de la Rocha embodied the righteous agitator spirit of the modern spiritual exile, the deep sustaining foundation, the theological survival kit of the modern era, was forged by public broadcasting. Long before the great deconstruction of the 2020s forced them out of the pews, the eventual inhabitants of the church in the wilderness were secretly prepared for their exile by Fred Rogers and LeVar Burton. While the institutional church of their youth increasingly modeled a faith rooted in performative spectacle, cultural boundary-keeping, and intellectual surrender, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Reading Rainbow offered a quiet, subversive alternative. Mr. Rogers, an ordained Presbyterian minister who viewed the television broadcast as his literal parish, taught a generation the incarnational grace of radical neighborliness. He consistently countered the church's narrative of inherent human worthlessness with the scandalous foundational gospel of inherent human dignity. Burton, conversely, taught them how to think, by ending his weekly literary explorations with the iconic phrase, "But you don't have to take my word for it." Burton inadvertently baptized millions of children into the intellectual lineage of the Bereans. He granted them the autonomy to investigate, read widely, and seek the truth for themselves without fear of reprisal. Today, the American religious landscape has been fundamentally reordered. The religious institutions that demanded blind submission and political syncretism have hemorrhaged a generation that refused to stop asking questions. But those who walked away didn't abandon the way of Jesus. They carried it into the wilderness. The decentralized, relational, and deeply compassionate church in the wilderness, not merely surviving but thriving outside the walls of the institutional church, didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was built by a generation that realized theology without neighborliness is dead religion, and investigating the truth isn't an act of rebellion, but a holy mandate. The institutional church spent decades desperately trying to protect its youth from the corrupting influence of the secular world, unaware that public broadcasting was teaching them the character of Christ more effectively than the institution ever did. For kids raised in the evangelical ecosystem of the late 20th century, Childhood was marked by a deep, if unspoken, theological whiplash. On Sunday mornings, the institutional church subjected them to a relentless barrage of messages about their inherent worthlessness. They were nearly drowned in the doctrine of total depravity, the worm theology that insisted their baseline state was one of wicked rebellion, and that their only value lay in the imputed righteousness of Christ, which barely covered their filthy rags. But on weekday afternoons, sitting on carpeted floors in front of glowing television sets, they encountered a wildly different gospel. A soft-spoken man in a zip-up cardigan would look directly into the camera, piercing the screen's barrier, and declare, "I like you just the way you are." To the guardians of hyper-conservative evangelicalism, this sounded like the dangerous creep of secular humanism, or the coddling of the self-esteem movement. But Mr. Rogers was no secular humanist. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister who had explicitly petitioned his denomination to recognize television as his parish. His message wasn't a departure from Christian orthodoxy. It was a desperately needed reclamation of the Imago Dei. Before the fall, there was the creation, and God, the Creator, called it good. And Mr. Rogers operated from the profound conviction that recognizing the inherent dignity and specialness of a human being was the necessary prerequisite for grace. You can't truly love a neighbor if you fundamentally despise their humanity. By telling children they had value simply for existing, Mr. Rogers was quietly inoculating them against the spiritual abuse that often masqueraded as discipleship in the institutional church. He offered a theological counter-narrative. When the pulpits of their youth demanded performative perfection and theological compliance to earn a place in the church community, his neighborhood offered unconditional belonging. But Mr. Rogers didn't merely preach this theology of inherent worth. He lived it through a liturgy of radical neighborliness. Perhaps the most striking example occurred in 1969, during the height of racial segregation and civil unrest in America. In a quiet, unhurried moment, Mr. Rogers sat outside his television house on a hot day. He invited Officer Clemens, a black police officer portrayed by Francois Clemens, to take off his shoes and share a small plastic wading pool to cool his feet. This wasn't just poignant social commentary, it was the Sermon on the Mount broadcast into millions of living rooms across North America. It was a visceral, incarnational demonstration of the Christ who washed the feet. Rogers even took a towel and dried Officer Clemens' feet as he prepared to leave. For the children watching, this became the gold standard of what faith in action looked like. Years later, when the institutional church began to align itself heavily with political platforms that championed exclusion, racial division, and the marginalization of the vulnerable, this generation felt a deep, instinctive revulsion. Their theological baseline for neighbor hadn't been set by a culture-warring pastor. It had been set by the man in the zip-up cardigan sharing his water. In addition, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood served as a vital emotional sanctuary. The institutional church culture of the 90s and 2000s relied heavily on toxic positivity. Joy in the Lord was weaponized as a mandate. Expressing deep grief, doubt, anger, or depression was often treated as a lack of faith or unconfessed sin. The believer was expected to put on a sanitized smile, mask their pain, and project absolute victory. Mr. Rogers dismantled this performative piety and wrote songs asking, "What do you do with the mad that you feel?" He brought a dead goldfish onto the set to talk with children about the terrifying reality of death and loss. He consistently reminded his audience that feelings are mentionable and manageable. He created a psychological and spiritual safe space where messy, unresolved, and difficult emotions weren't seen as a threat to God's sovereignty, but as a normal part of the human experience that deserved to be heard and held. This emotional vocabulary proved essential to the survival kit of today's church in the wilderness. When the deconstruction of this generation began en masse and in earnest, the institutions failed, the church's political idolatry became too much to bear, and the religious trauma finally surfaced. These exiles didn't completely shatter. They had been given the tools to sit with their grief for a time. They knew how to begin processing their profound spiritual disillusionment because Mr. Rogers had taught them that anger and sadness don't disqualify you from being loved. When they walked away from the glaring lights of the church stage and into the disorienting quiet of the spiritual wilderness, they weren't walking away from God. They were searching for the God who changes his shoes, sits in the dirt, and invites them to speak their pain. They were looking for the divine neighbor, and because of PBS, they already knew what he sounded like. If Mr. Rogers provided the emotional sanctuary the church in the wilderness needed to survive, LeVar Burton provided its intellectual framework. While Mr. Rogers' neighborhood taught a generation how to love, Reading Rainbow taught them how to think. The premise of Reading Rainbow was deceptively simple: encourage children to read. But the pedagogy beneath the surface was radically subversive, especially when contrasted with the authoritarian religious environments many of these children inhabited, especially on the weekends. In every episode, Burton would take viewers on an immersive, documentary-style journey, exploring the themes of a specific book. He was the enthusiastic guide, trusted narrator, and caring teacher. But the show's true genius and its most profound theological acknowledgement lay in its transition. At the climax of the episode, just as Burton had fully captivated his audience and established his authority on the subject, he would smile and deliver his iconic sign-off. But you don't have to take my word for it. With that single phrase, Burton voluntarily decentralized his own power. He handed the broadcast over to a diverse panel of children who offered their own unvarnished, independent reviews of other books. He was telling his young audience in no uncertain terms that while he was a helpful guide, he was not the ultimate arbiter of truth. He was granting them intellectual autonomy, allowing them to investigate, read for themselves, and form their own conclusions. It was an impartation of holy curiosity and a healthy, constructive dose of skepticism. Without knowing it, Burton was baptizing a generation of kids in the spirit of the Bereans. In the New Testament, the book of Acts recounts the Apostle Paul's missionary journey to the Macedonian city of Berea. Paul was arguably the ultimate religious authority of the early Christian movement, a Pharisee of Pharisees who had encountered the risen Christ, and an apostle who wrote what would become the church's very scriptures. When he arrived in Thessalonica, he faced riots and rejection, but in Berea, the response was different. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Acts 17:11. The biblical text doesn't commend the Bereans for blind submission, or praise them for shutting off their critical faculties and accepting Paul's apostolic authority without question. Instead, it calls them noble, precisely because they cross-examined the apostle's sermon against the text. They listened eagerly, but they didn't take his word for it. They investigated and read the scrolls for themselves. This noble Berean ethos stood in stark contrast to the evangelical subculture these children were navigating. During the 90s and early 2000s, the institutional church became increasingly obsessed with centralized, unquestionable authority. The pastor as CEO model of the megachurch movement, coupled with the rigidity of fundamentalism, created an environment in which questions were often treated as threats. The pulpit was presented as the sole mediator of divine truth, and bumper sticker theology ruled the day. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. In these religious spaces, questioning a pastor's interpretation of Scripture, challenging a church policy, or pointing out theological inconsistencies was often met with spiritual gaslighting. Young people were warned about the slippery slope of doubt. They were told to touch not the Lord's anointed. Investigating too closely was to flirt with heresy. Questioning the leader was to question God himself. The institution hoarded the truth and demanded blind, passive consumption from the pews. But the church had a profound problem on its hands. It was preaching to a congregation already discipled by Burton. You can't raise a child on Reading Rainbow and then expect them to thrive in an environment of unquestioning authoritarian dogma. When the PBS disciple generation grew up and noticed the glaring cracks in the institutional church, the political syncretism, the cover-ups of abuse, the historical inaccuracies, and the weaponization of the Bible against the marginalized, They did exactly what they had been trained to do. They didn't passively accept the pastor's frantic assurances that everything was fine. They went to the library, opened the books, and sought out marginalized voices, historical context, and original languages. When the pulpit declared that God mandated Christian nationalism, that women must be silently subjugated, or that systemic injustice was a secular myth, the latchkey disciples felt a deep, instinctive friction. They remembered the lesson of the television screen. The truest sign of a trustworthy teacher encourages you to verify the lesson yourself. The institutional church would eventually label this mass exodus of truth-seeking as deconstruction, mourning it as a tragic loss of faith. But for the church in the wilderness, it wasn't a loss of faith at all, but the activation of it. It was the profound realization that investigating the claims of the powerful isn't rebellion. It's the truest, most noble form of spiritual engagement. They had become a massive, decentralized Berean book club, committed to discovering the actual historical Jesus hidden beneath decades of cultural baggage, armed with a library card and a sacred refusal to take the empire's word for it. In any form of communication, but especially in the realm of spiritual formation, the medium is intrinsically tied to the message. The generation that now makes up the majority of the church in the wilderness was subjected to a highly engineered and specific medium of religious instruction during their formative years. The late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed the explosive rise of the seeker-sensitive church, an era that fundamentally redefined the architectural and pedagogical landscape of American evangelicalism. The traditional sanctuaries of the past, spaces designed with upward-sweeping architecture intended to draw the eye toward the heavens, or a central communion table, were rapidly replaced by spaces modeled after concert arenas and corporate auditoriums. The pedagogy of the megachurch relied heavily on spectacle. It utilized smoke machines, blaring multi-sensory worship bands, highly calibrated lighting cues, and a manic, relentless energy designed to manufacture a transcendent, spiritual experience on demand. This spatial arrangement communicated a profound, if unintended, theology. The stage was significantly elevated, physically and symbolically separating the anointed performer, the pastor or worship leader, from the passive audience sitting in the darkened seats below. It was a profoundly above-us ministry. The message embedded in the architecture was clear. God's presence is mediated through the professional on the platform, and your primary role as a congregant is to sit in the dark, consume the content, and be emotionally moved by the production. Now contrast this overstimulating, hierarchical religious spectacle with the quiet, deliberate pedagogy of weekday public broadcasting. Mr. Rogers and Burton approached their audiences with a radically different spatial and relational dynamic. They didn't perform from an elevated stage, nor did they rely on manic pacing or sensory overload to hold a child's attention. Instead, they used the television to create a profound sense of incarnational intimacy. They spoke slowly and allowed long, unhurried pauses of dead air, a cardinal sin in modern commercial broadcasting, but a vital necessity for human reflection and emotional processing. Most importantly, they positioned the camera directly at eye level. When Mr. Rogers walked through the door, changed his sweater, and looked directly into the camera, he wasn't delivering a monologue to a faceless crowd. He was looking at you. He closed the distance and didn't talk down to children. He stooped to their level, treating them as intellectual and spiritual equals. Burton employed the same incarnational approach, taking the viewer by the hand and walking with them through the pages of a book or the streets of a new city, rather than lecturing from behind a heavy wooden podium. This eye-level ministry modeled a profoundly different vision of authority and presence. It was a with-us pedagogy. If the church stage implicitly taught that God was distant, high up, and required a professional mediator to access, the PBS living room taught that the deepest truths could be encountered quietly, relationally, and directly. Mr. Rogers and Burton embodied the incarnational reality of Emmanuel, God with us, better than the auditorium lights ever could. As the latchkey generation matured into adults, this dual upbringing inevitably created friction. Having been quietly discipled by the authentic, intimate presence of Mr. Rogers and Burton, they developed a highly attuned, almost subconscious radar for emotional manipulation. When they sat in the modern church, the glaring lights and carefully orchestrated emotional crescendos began to feel hollow. They recognized that the institutional church often substituted adrenaline for the Holy Spirit. The performative pulpit demanded a continuous, exhausting escalation of the spectacle to keep the audience engaged, resulting in a religious culture that was a mile wide and an inch deep. When the cascading crises of the 2020s arrived, including the aggressive politicization of the pulpit, the exposure of systemic moral failures within church leadership, and the collective trauma of a global pandemic, the spectacle completely lost its power to comfort or guide. You can't smoke machine your way out of profound religious trauma or deep spiritual doubt. This explains why the church in the wilderness is deeply, instinctively allergic to church as entertainment. The spiritual exiles who walked away from the institution didn't lose their hunger for God. They lost their tolerance for the performance. They realized the elevated stage was often a hiding place for unaccountable power, and the manic energy of the Sunday service was often a distraction from the slow, quiet work of actual discipleship. Today, the gathering spaces of the spiritual wilderness look markedly different from the churches of their youth. These exiles gather in living rooms, around dining room tables, in local coffee shops, and in community centers. They've rejected the stadium in favor of the neighborhood, craving the quiet, eye-level intimacy they first experienced on their carpeted floors at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. They want a faith that looks them in the eye, speaks slowly, and holds space for silence. They learned from PBS that the most profound, life-altering truths aren't shouted through a PA system. They're spoken softly by a neighbor who's taken the time to sit with them. The inevitable collision between the generation discipled by public broadcasting and the modern institutional church was only a matter of time. You can't plant the seeds of inherent human dignity and intellectual autonomy into the minds of children and expect those seeds not to bear fruit in adulthood. As the kids of the 90s matured amid the socio-political turbulence of the late 2000s and the 2020s, they found themselves sitting in pews that demanded a profound and terrifying form of cognitive dissonance. The crisis point arrived when the institutional church began to aggressively merge its theology with overt partisan politics, ultimately culminating in the rise of Christian nationalism. From the pulpit, this generation was suddenly being told Jesus required unquestioning allegiance to specific political figures. Systemic injustice was a secular Marxist myth. Refugees and immigrants were a threat to the nation's Christian heritage. And the ultimate goal of the church was to seize levers of cultural and governmental power. When faced with this jarring, exclusionary rhetoric, the PBS reflex kicked in violently. The adults sitting in those darkened auditoriums remembered the quiet voice of Burton echoing across the decades. But you don't have to take my word for it. So they didn't. When the pastor declared that America was uniquely covenanted to God, they did what they had been trained to do. They went to the library, opened the history books, read about the doctrine of discovery, the theological justifications for chattel slavery, and the indigenous genocides that built the nation. When the pulpit demanded strict patriarchal submission and the silencing of women, they cross-examined the sermon. They studied the cultural context of the Greco-Roman world, the prominent leadership roles of women in the early church, and the radical, egalitarian way Jesus actually treated the women in the Gospels. When they were told that their LGBTQ+ neighbors were an inherent threat to the fabric of society, they remembered Mr. Rogers sharing a wading pool with a black man in a segregated America. They recognized the same spirit of exclusionary fear attempting to disguise itself as holiness. This process of rigorous, painful investigation came to be known in the cultural lexicon as deconstruction. And the institutional church absolutely panicked. From the vantage point of the religious elite, this mass exodus of truth-seeking was viewed as a catastrophic spiritual failure. Pastors preached fiery sermons warning about the disease of deconstruction, framing it as a rebellious backsliding into secularism. a cynical trend or a slippery slope straight to atheism. The institution treated the congregants' questions not as a plea for deeper understanding, but as an act of treason against the system. They failed to realize they weren't losing a generation to secularism. They were losing a generation to the very Berean ethics they claimed to uphold, but had long since abandoned in favor of political power. For the church in the wilderness, deconstruction was never a bug in the system. It was a feature. It was the necessary theological immune response of a healthy soul rejecting a toxic pathogen. Asking hard questions, dismantling toxic theology, and refusing to accept bumper sticker apologetics was simply the application of the reading rainbow ethic to their own faith. It was the ancient Christian tradition of faith-seeking understanding. This generation possessed the profound, unshakable conviction that if God is actually the author of truth, then a relentless, honest pursuit of the truth could never ultimately lead them away from God. To fear investigation is to confess that your God is too fragile to survive the light of day. For the vast majority of these spiritual exiles, deconstruction wasn't the destruction of their faith. It was a refusal to settle for a cheap, Americanized counterfeit. They were willing to endure the agonizing, disorienting pain of having their worldview shattered because they believed something truer and more beautiful was buried beneath the rubble. By refusing to take the empire's word for it, they stripped away the capitalist, hyper-individualized, and politically weaponized savior of modern evangelicalism. In doing so, they found the actual, historical Jesus waiting for them in the wilderness. They found the brown-skinned, marginalized Jewish rabbi who washed feet, subverted the religious elite of his day, centered the poor, and embodied the ultimate radical love of the divine neighbor. They lost their religion, but they kept their Christ. For those observing from the comfortable seats of the institutional religious empire, the mass exodus of the 2020s looked like an apocalypse. To the megachurch CEO, deconstruction was synonymous with destruction, leaving behind nothing but the ashes of abandoned faith. But this assessment betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happens in the spiritual wilderness. The wilderness isn't a wasteland, it's a laboratory. Having systematically dismantled the toxic, performative, and politically syncretized elements of their childhood religion, the exiles didn't simply vanish into the ether of secular nihilism. They began to rebuild. But what exactly is the church in the wilderness in 2026? Ecclesiologically, it looks nothing like the institutions they left behind. The institutional church operated on a strictly centralized hub-and-spoke model. The institution was the hub, hoarding resources, authority, and theological dictates. At the same time, the congregants were the spokes, expected to funnel their time and money back into the center to maintain the spectacle. The church in the wilderness, by contrast, is a decentralized, distributed network. It's highly relational, localized, and deliberately stripped of overhead. There are no celebrity pastors to protect, no multi-million-dollar building funds to maintain, and no political lobbying arms to fund. Instead, the landscape of this new movement looks remarkably like the world Fred Rogers built. It's scaled down to the exact, intimate size of a neighborhood. In this decentralized space, the very definition of liturgy has been radically rewritten. The liturgy of the institutional church was primarily a consumer experience. A laser light show, a meticulously rehearsed worship set, and a 40-minute motivational speech. The liturgy of the wilderness isn't a performance, it's a localized action. The new liturgy of care resembles mutual aid networks in an era of crushing inflation and supply chain friction. It looks like organizing community gardens, advocating for the marginalized at city council meetings, protecting vulnerable youth from legislative hostility, and standing in the gap for immigrants and refugees. It's the realization that participating in the kingdom of God doesn't mean sitting in a dark room singing songs about God. It means going out into the street and doing the actual unglamorous work of Jesus. Mr. Rogers famously advised children navigating scary times to look for the helpers. The church in the wilderness has taken that gentle pastoral advice and transformed it into a missiological mandate. They don't want to be the cultural power brokers, or conquer the government, or dominate the school boards. They want to be the helpers, taking the radical, unconditional inclusion of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and applying it as the ultimate expression of Christian discipleship. This is where the grand synthesis of their PBS discipleship culminates in a beautiful conclusion. In the wilderness, the two streams of their childhood formation finally merge into a cohesive theology. The intellectual autonomy of LeVar Burton and the incarnational grace of Mr. Rogers. Deconstruction, without a mechanism for reconstruction, runs the very real risk of turning a believer into a cynical, detached academic. If one possesses only the critical lens of reading Rainbow, the mandate to question everything and demand the truth, they might escape a toxic system, but they'll likely end up alone, angry, and cold. Conversely, if one possesses only the soft, unconditional acceptance of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood without the intellectual rigor to recognize systemic abuse, they risk becoming a naive participant in systems that harm the vulnerable. But when you combine the two, you forge the ultimate theological survival kit. Burton's pursuit of truth ensures that the church in the wilderness can't be manipulated by charismatic charlatans or Christian nationalist propaganda. They're modern Bereans who will always demand receipts. But Rogers' pursuit of love ensures that their theology never becomes a weapon. They understand, as the Apostle James wrote, that faith without works is dead. Theology without neighborliness is just dead religion wearing a different mask. The spiritual exiles of today have come to a profound realization. True Bereans don't merely study ancient texts to win online theological debates. They study the text to build a better neighborhood. They've recognized that the teachings of Jesus were never meant to be the foundational documents of a political empire. They were the blueprints for a localized, radical community of care. By holding fiercely to the truth and loving their neighbors without condition, they're proving that the church in the wilderness isn't the death of American Christianity. It might just be its salvation. Looking back at the spiritual formation of the latchkey generation, the profound irony is almost blinding. The institutional church of the 90s and early 2000s spent millions of dollars and countless hours trying to build an impenetrable fortress against the secular world. They created alternative Christian media, music, and insular subcultures specifically designed to protect their youth from outside influence. Yet, while the religious gatekeepers were busy guarding the front door against imagined cultural threats, the actual character of Christ was quietly slipping into the living room through the television set. Mr. Rogers and Burton were the accidental theologians of a generation. Without a stadium stage, a smoke machine, or a political lobbying arm, they managed to disciple millions of children in the profound, ancient ways of Jesus. They taught a generation that every human being possesses an inherent, unshakable dignity, that questions aren't a sign of spiritual rebellion, but a prerequisite for truth. They demonstrated that authority should be gentle, power should be shared, and the ultimate measure of any belief system is how it treats the most vulnerable person in the neighborhood. Today, the church in the wilderness isn't a monument to lost faith. It's a living, breathing testament to the resilience of the gospel when it's finally freed from the suffocating grip of empire. This decentralized relational movement is thriving precisely because it's built upon those two unshakable PBS pillars: the incarnational grace to love without condition, and the Berean courage to seek the truth without fear. To the spiritual exiles, the deconstructors, and the latchkey disciples currently navigating the wilderness, don't let the religious institution convince you that you've lost your way. You're exactly where the Spirit of God is moving. So, keep the afternoon lessons alive. Keep reading, keep going to the library, examining the history, and cross-examining the powerful. Keep holding space for the messy, unresolved grief of the people around you. And keep taking off your shoes and sharing the water with those the empire has marginalized. The future of the faith doesn't depend on saving the institutional church. It depends entirely on whether we're willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of building a better neighborhood. But as always, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at the love, the justice, and the radical grace blooming in the wilderness. The fruit speaks for itself. thank you for joining me for this episode. If you found today's discussion meaningful, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. The conversation doesn't stop when the audio ends. Head over to Substack to join the community, read our full essays, and share your own perspectives in the comments. We have a lot of exciting new projects in the works, and we truly can't wait to share them with you. Your continued engagement and support are exactly what help make these future realities possible. Until next time, keep seeking the truth and keep looking out for your neighbors.